Good morning. All right, chapter 3, the Torrance Tornado. This is Louie. There's Louie right there as the Torrance Tornado, and there's his brother Pete. Okay. So, as we read, again, we're looking for 3 things. 1, theme. 2, central ideas. And 3, social issues. If you're having trouble with social issues are things that keep a society from being perfect. So I've provided a list or a link to a list of different social issue examples in the slide where you fill out the chart. Okay. So chapter 3, the Torrance Tornado. It happened every Saturday. Louie went to the track, limbered up, lay in the infield visualizing his coming race, and then walked to the line and awaited the pop of the gun and sprang away. Pete dashed around the infield. The infield is the inside of the track. So Pete dashed around the infield yelling instructions. Then when Pete gave the signal, Louie stretched out his legs and the opponent scattered behind him. Louie glided over the line and Pete tackled him, and the kids in the bleachers cheered and stomped. Louie won so many wristwatches, the traditional prize of track, that he handed them out all over town. So he's winning so many times and every time he wins, he gets a wristwatch. So he's handing them out all over town because he has so many. Louie's supreme high school moment came in the 1934 Southern California Track and Field Championship. Running in the best field of high school milers ever assembled, he routed them all and smoked the mile in 4 minutes, 21.3 seconds, shattering the national high school record. So he runs the mile in this event and he shatters the national, like the entire United States, national high school record. His main pursuer so exhausted himself that he had to be carried off the track. A reporter predicted that Louie's record would stand for 20 years. It stood for 19. Once his hometown's arch villain, Louie was now a superstar, and Torrance forgave him for everything. The LA Times was striped with stories on the Torrance Tornado. Rumor had it that the Torrance Herald had insured Louie's legs for $50,000. Torrancers carpooled to see his races and crammed the grandstands. So this whole town that had hated him because of how he was has now forgiven him and they're all loading up in cars to go see him. Embarrassed, Louie asked his parents not to come. Louise snuck to the track fence anyway, but got so nervous that she covered her eyes. Not long ago, Louie's aspirations had been satisfied by robbing kitchens. So he used to be okay with just robbing kitchens, but now he latched on to a wildly ambitious goal. He wanted to qualify for the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. The games had no mile race, so milers ran 1,500 meters, a little short of a mile. It was a seasoned man's game. Most milers peaked in their mid to late 20s. So most people that run the event that Louie wants to run at the Olympics, most people that run this are in their best shape in their 20s. And how old is Louie right now? He is in high school. The 1,500 meter favorite was Glenn Cunningham, who set the miles world record at 4 minutes and 6.7 seconds, just after Louie set the high school record. At the 36 games, Cunningham would be almost 27, and wouldn't peak until he was 28. In 1936, Louie would only be 19. So let's think about some things that are not, you know how driven Louie is, but think about the obstacles that are in his way. Okay, so he's too young. He's not seasoned. He's only been running for a little bit of time, where all these other runners, they're professional runners and they're used to doing this kind of stuff. And they're in their 20s, which is your peak time for running. But Louie was improving so quickly, he'd lopped off a staggering 42 seconds off of his mile time in the last 2 years. Track experts thought that he might be the exception to the rule. And after he went undefeated in his senior season, their confidence strengthened. Louie and Pete believed that he could make the team. Louie wanted to run in Berlin more than he'd ever wanted anything. In December 1935, Louie graduated from high school, and days later rang in 1936 with his thoughts full of Berlin, just 7 months away. He was buried in scholarship offers. Pete, now at the University of Southern California, urged Louie to choose that same school, but to delay entry until fall so that he could train. Louie moved into Pete's frat house, and Pete coached him, training obsessively for Berlin. And this is a picture right here of Louie competing in one of the races in high school. And those are his track shoes. He kept them. He kept a lot of stuff. So he's training for the Olympics in the 1500 meter. By spring, he realized that he wasn't going to make it. Though he was getting faster every day, he couldn't force his body to improve quickly enough to catch the 1500 meter rivals by the summer. He was simply too young. Louie was heartbroken. In May, Louie was looking through a newspaper when he saw a story on the Compton Open, a prestigious track meet held on May 22nd. The headliner in the 5,000 meter was 26-year-old Norman Bright, America's second fastest meter man behind Don Lash, a 23-year-old record-smashing machine. America would send 3 5,000 meter men to Berlin, and Lash and Bright were considered locks. So remember, Louie doesn't qualify for the 1500, and he's heartbroken. But now what is he thinking about trying to qualify for? He's trying to qualify for a race that he's never run, the 5,000. And I don't know if any of y'all have ever run track, but I did long distance in high school. And track, when you're doing, there's a huge difference in doing the mile and doing the 2 mile. And you have to be practiced at knowing how to run both, knowing how to pace yourself. So Louie is trying to compete because he wants to go to the Olympics so bad. He's trying to compete in a race that he has never, ever run. And just from experience, because I did both the 2 mile and the mile in high school, there's a huge difference between the two, and you have to know what you're doing. So Louie's going to try and compete to go to the Olympics in this race that he has never run before. Never. Pete urged Louie to enter Bright's race. If you stay with Norman Bright, he said, you can make the Olympic team. The idea was a stretch. The mile was 4 laps, and the 5,000 was more than 12. So he's going from 4 laps around the track to 12. That's a heck of a difference. Louie had only twice raced beyond a mile, and the 5,000 meter, like the mile, was dominated by much older men. He had only 2 weeks to train. And with the Olympic trials in July, 2 months to become America's youngest elite 5,000 man. But he had nothing to lose. He trained so hard that his feet bled. The race was a barn burner. Louie and Bright flew off, leaving the field far behind. Lap after lap, they dueled, trading the lead and sending roars through the crowd. They turned into the final home stretch, and with the crowd screaming, finished almost dead even. In the fastest 5,000 meter run in America in 1936, Bright had just won by a glimmer. In June, after Louie performed brilliantly in 2 more 5,000 meters, an invitation to the Olympic trials arrived. His Berlin dream was on again. Just some background in case you don't know. If you want to qualify for something in the Olympics, you have to go to several big, well-known track meets. And they're all across the country, but national track meets. And so that's what Louie just competed in one. But you have to compete in several. And if you do well in several of those track meets, then you get an invitation to try out for the Olympics. That's the Olympic trials. So Louie he runs that race, he gets second. He runs good in a couple more races, and so then he gets invited to try out for the Olympics. On July 3rd, 1936, residents of Torrance gathered to see Louie off to the Olympic trials in New York. They gave him a wallet and traveling money, a train ticket, and a suitcase emblazoned with the words Torrance Tornado. Fearing the suitcase made him look brash, Louie discreetly stuck adhesive tape over his nickname and then set off. He spent the journey introducing himself to every pretty girl on the train. And there is Louie's, he still has it, Louie's suitcase. And it says, you can see it right here. There's his name. And I don't see the Torrance Tornado anywhere. When the train doors opened in New York, Louie felt like he was walking into an inferno. It was the hottest summer on record in New York and in America, and New York was especially hard hit. In 1936, air conditioning was rare, found only in a few theaters and department stores, so escape was nearly impossible. That week, the heat would kill 3,000 Americans, 40 of them in New York, where it hit 106 degrees. So he's at a track meet. First off, he's out of state. He's flown across the country to New York. He's in California to New York. He's also having to compete in really, really hot weather. And those of you that run track know that when you run in the heat, it will dehydrate you and you can get really sick. You can get sun poisoning. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. And they don't have any air conditioner. This is the 1930s. Nobody had air conditioning back then. The only places that had air conditioning were movie theaters and big buildings that were for events. In spite of the heat, Louie had to train, sweating profusely day and night, training in the sun, unable to sleep in the heat. Virtually every athlete lost a huge amount of weight. By one estimate, no athlete lost less than 10 pounds. One virtually moved into an air-conditioned theater and bought tickets to movies and slept through every showing. So they bought tickets and slept in the movie theater so they could get cool. Louie was as miserable as everyone else. His weight dropped. The pre-race newspaper coverage riled him. Don Lash was considered unbeatable. Bright was pegged for second. Louie wasn't even mentioned. He was worried about Lash. But the first 3 runners would go to Berlin, and he believed that he could be among them. "If I have any strength left from the heat," he wrote to Pete, I'll beat Bright and give Lash the scare of his life." The trials were held at the stadium on New York's Randall Island. It was just short of 90 in the city, but the stadium was much hotter, probably far over 100 degrees. Everywhere, athletes were keeling over and being carted to the hospital. Louie waited for his race under a scalding sun that later, he said, made a wreck of me. At last, the men were told to line up. The gun cracked and the race was on. Lash bounded into the lead with Bright in pursuit. Louie dropped back. In the Zamperini house, a huge group crouched around the radio. They were in agony. Louie's start time had passed, but the announcer was lingering on the swimming trials. Pete was so frustrated that he considered putting his foot through the radio. They're all listening at home and they can't hear anything because there's somebody else announcing the swim trials. At last, the announcer listed the positions of the 5,000-meter runners. He didn't even mention Louie. Overwhelmed, Louise fled to the kitchen. Lash and Bright led the runners through laps 7, 8, and 9. Louie hovered mid-pack, waiting to make his move. The heat was suffocating. One runner collapsed and the other runners hurdled him. Another dropped, and they jumped him too. Louie could feel his feet cooking as the spikes on his shoes conducted heat from the track. Bright's feet were burned particularly badly. In terrible pain, he took a staggering step off the track and twisted his ankle and then lurched back on. So the track is so hot. I've had this happen too. Sometimes when you're running, you can feel the heat of the track if it's really hot outside on the bottoms of your feet. And they have on track spikes. And so it is so hot out there that the track spikes are taking that heat up into the bottom of their shoes, and it's hurting them, it's burning them. So Bright, who's in second place, his feet are burning him so badly that he accidentally missteps and twists his ankle and accidentally steps off the track. Louie passed him, and he had no resistance to offer. As the runners entered the final lap, Louie accelerated, closing in on Lash. Looking at the bobbing head of the mighty Don Lash, Louie felt intimidated. For several strides he hesitated. Then he saw the last curve ahead, and he opened up as fast as he could go. And here's the Olympic trials. So there is Louie, and this is the finish. There's Louie, and then there's Don Lash. Look how close they are at the finish line. Banking around the turn, Louie drew alongside Lash, and the two men were side by side running down the home stretch. Neither man had any more speed to give, and neither could get past the other. Exhausted, straining with heads thrown back and legs moving in sync, they hit the line together. The announcer's voice echoed across the living room in Torrance. Zamperini had won. In the kitchen, Louise heard the crowd in the next room suddenly shout. Outside, car horns honked. The front door swung open and neighbors gushed in. As a crush of hysterical Torrancers celebrated around her, Louise wept happy tears. Anthony poured wine and sang toast. Louie's voice came over the airwaves, calling a greeting to Torrance. The announcer was mistaken. The judges had ruled Lash the winner. The announcer corrected himself, but it hardly dimmed the revelry in Torrance. A few minutes later, Louie stood under a cold shower. His feet were burned, and there were marks following the pattern of his spikes. So on the bottom of his feet, he's got these little burns all over his feet, and they're from where the spikes are in his shoes. After drying off, he weighed himself. He had sweated off 3 pounds that day. Norman Bright was slumped on a bench, staring at his foot. It, like the other one, was burned so badly that the skin had peeled off, and he had finished 5th. So the guy that was supposed to get 2nd twists his ankle and doesn't end up going to the Olympics. By the day's end, Louie had received 125 telegrams. Torrance has gone nuts, read one. Village has gone screwy, read another. There was even one from the Torrance police, who must have been relieved that someone else was chasing Louie. Louie pored over photos of his race in the evening papers. In some, it looked like he tied with Lash, and in others, he appeared to be in the front. On the track, he'd felt sure that he won. The top 3 finishers would go to Berlin, but Louie felt cheated nonetheless. As Louie studied the papers, the judges were reviewing photos and a film of the 5,000. Later, Louie telegrammed the news home. The judges called it a tie. We'll run harder in Berlin. The Zamperini house was packed with well-wishers and newsmen. Anthony drank toast until 4 in the morning. Pete walked around to backslaps. I'm ever happy, he wrote to Louie. I have to go around with my shirt open so that I have enough room for my chest. Louie Zamperini was going to compete in the Olympics in an event that he had only run 4 times. He was the youngest distance runner to ever make the Olympic team. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 3. So Louie is finally going to the Olympics. So let's look at central idea. So if you've got your 5 questions, who, what, when, where, why. So here's our 5. So obviously the who is Louie. What happened in this section that was the most important? Louie runs and qualifies in a race that he has a goal of competing in the Olympics, and he eventually qualifies in a race that he's never even won. When does this happen? In the Olympic trials. Where does this happen? At the Olympic trials in New York. And what was the author's purpose? To inform. So when you create a sentence, you're going to be adding all of these together. So it would start something like, the author informs readers that Louie Zamperini, and then go from there. All right, I'll talk to y'all later.